So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the scripture for March 31st. Maybe, if you're like me, you've experienced church politics before. Maybe, if you're like me, you've experienced that church politics can be destructive, heartless. It can take people who are otherwise totally committed to Christ in every other aspect of their lives and twist them and pervert their aims. It's really just a horrifying mess, is what church politics tends to be. That's because in order to politic well, you have to use cunning and you have to almost work within the shadows sometimes. And that's antithetical to the life of faith, at least the life of faith as we live it together. In other words, the church cannot have people who use the community for political gain. Now, this doesn't mean that the church cannot have politicians in it. Politicians need Jesus just like you or I. But it does mean that when it comes to our shared life together in worship, to politic that, to wrestle for position, that's antithetical to who we are as a church. And that's sort of what Paul's saying to the Corinthians here in 2 Corinthians 4. There's a time and a place that Christians can work in local or state or regional or federal positions. That's all well and good. But that time and place is not during church committee meetings. It's not during worship meetings. Instead, we're called as Christians to be really and truly ourselves with nothing to hide, because that's what Jesus would have us do. That's who Jesus made us to be. And so if we're operating from the shadows, the very way that we're doing business works against the business we're trying to do, if that makes sense. There's a phrase that goes something like, the medium is the message, and that's what's going on with church politicking sometimes, where you may not know that you're suggesting that, hey, you got to be cunning in order to work the process, but by the very nature of integrating politics with the church, that is kind of what you're doing, working from the shadows. The God who spoke light into the darkness wants to shine on our church. And so when deals are being done in secret, when we're operating in small groups of 2 or 3 trying to compete against other groups, we're doing it wrong. If others want to conceal themselves from this light, they can. Of course, God gives us that freedom to do so, but not in the church. We're a called out community, called out of darkness into the wonderful light that God's provided for us. Paul uses the analogy of clay jars to discuss how we're holding this glory that God has given us. And clay jars aren't the prettiest, aren't the strongest container that's available. They're not the flashiest material. But if flesh and blood can and did hold God in Jesus Christ, then our bodies can also shelter God's Spirit. That's the treasure that we've got in jars of clay. And in fact, just as Jesus carried his death with him throughout his entire life, so too we're able to live as those who are prepared to die, as we'll often say in our funeral liturgy. We're called to do the same thing as Christ. And that's one of the reasons that in early rituals of baptism that the church did, baptism was understood as a way of getting the dying over with beforehand. After all, in the time of persecution with the church, back in the early, first, second, third centuries, if the people who you're persecuting don't fear death, there's not a whole lot you can do to them. And so the church got the dying over with by incorporating dying to the world into the baptismal liturgy, which is why you put off your normal clothes sometimes and put on a garment of white. That's what the early church did. For this reason, early Christians didn't need to fear death, because Christ's life was already at work within them. And that's what Paul calls us to in this chapter. Paul's comparison of our concerns in this life offers a great reminder of how great the glory is that awaits us, particularly in comparison to how short our time is here on earth. That even if we suffer for as many years as we have here, the weight of eternal glory will outweigh that by factors of bajillions. He calls us, Paul does, to have eyes to see that which is to come, instead of just focusing on that which is right before us. So I wonder, what fears keep you from being really and truly yourself in the church and really and truly yourselves in the world? That's all for 2 Corinthians 4. Tomorrow, April 1st, we'll be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.